Hi, and welcome to CryptoBiography. I'm your host, Brandon Starr, and this is episode 134, and it's called The Woods. And I hope you enjoy it. Here we go. Tom had just turned 9 when his Uncle Terry died. He couldn't remember living with his dad, but the few times he had seen his father had convinced him that this wasn't a bad thing. When Uncle Terry died, he gave his house to his sister Anne. So Anne and Tom moved out of their apartment and into a house a little way out in the country, a little north of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Anne and Tom both liked the new house. They had a plot of land, though it had probably never been farmed, and they had no plans to do so. They did enjoy walking around it. It had a bit of open field near the house, and then several acres of forest that abutted the national forest. Tom liked walking through the forest alone, as well as with his mom. As the months passed, his mom got used to his longer and longer walks. She worked from home, and so he had a lot of time at home himself. There was a rickety barbed wire fence separating Anne's property from the national forest. Tom had long since learned to duck under it and go further and further into the forest. He knew every tree, every path. There were supposed to be brown bears, but he never saw any. Anne didn't know how far Tom went, and Tom didn't really want her to know. It felt good to him, like a small achievement, all on his own. The woods were all evergreen, mostly ponderosa and Douglas fir. They were untouched, being far from any city or town, and just fortunate not to be logged in the 19th and early 20th centuries. After that, they didn't need luck, as they were in the national forest. What logging there was happened nowhere near them. Tom just enjoyed walking around. Other than the occasional narrow, mostly disused road and paths that were mostly made by animals rather than humans, there were no signs of humans at all. One Tuesday in July, a heat wave had just broken. Tom could go for a walk again, and he took a longer one than usual. He still knew where he was in relation to his house, but he went further than he had before. There was a hill he had never dared to go as far as, and decided to check it out. As he approached, Tom saw there was a tree leaning crazily away from him near the top of the hill. The root ball was pulled up out of the ground part way, and the tree itself continued like a massive seesaw. The branches were torn off for the most part, and he wasn't that great at tree identification, so he wasn't sure exactly what species it was, just that it didn't seem to be one of the usual ones around here. He climbed the root ball and noticed that it moved slightly. The tree, he found, was balanced just above the root ball, and the weight of the root ball was balanced by the long trunk, when the distances were taken into consideration. He bounced up and down on the root ball, enjoying the sensation it gave. As it moved, he looked down and saw several large rocks in the roots. They didn't seem to have grown around the rocks. Perhaps they had been pulled up when the tree had fallen over. He decided to play with the balance. He reached down and heaved one stone, then another, then a third. He was barely able to get them out of the root ball in one go, they were so heavy. The balance did indeed change. The trunk went down, slowly at first, then faster, until it thumped on the ground. The root ball, meanwhile, had risen quite a ways. Tom jumped on the root ball, but the balance had shifted enough, partly from the rocks, but possibly also from how the tree was now contacting the ground, and couldn't budge it. He jumped off and dusted himself. Then he saw that the root ball had risen up and uncovered an opening. Part of it would have been where the root ball had been originally, but there was also an opening beyond that. He hesitated. There were supposed to be bears in this forest, even if he hadn't seen one. But he'd come from this direction, and the hole wasn't really visible or available before, so it couldn't be a bear den. Probably. He listened very carefully. This was midsummer. If a bear was using it, it wouldn't be hibernating. Out of habit, he chewed the inside of his cheek. He heard nothing unusual. He stooped down and peered inside. He really couldn't see anything. The hill and the downed tree meant plenty of sunshine outside, with no light available to see the space that had been revealed. He walked closer. Nothing was amiss. He went down the short slope and looked straight in. It was too dark to tell what, if anything, was in there, but he still heard nothing. He stepped forward, and his head was out of the sunlight. He gave his eyes time to adjust, still listening intently. He could start to tell the size of the space. It was about the size of his living room, though not very high, perhaps 5 feet at its height, and sloping very slowly until the edges, which turned down to walls. The floor seemed nearly flat and quite smooth. There seemed to be a crack on the far side of the room. He moved forward a bit. His eyes continued to adjust. Something moved near the crack. He froze and looked at it. Nothing was moving. He was still crouching. His legs grew shaky from fear and adrenaline, and he couldn't help himself. He dropped on one knee and one hand on the jerked floor. The thing at the crack also moved, then stopped moving. He realized what it was. A reflection. He slowly moved forward. As he did so, his reflection came towards him. It was definitely a reflection. It wasn't until he got quite close in the dim cave that he could see what was causing it. A mirror. A very old mirror. He suspected it was an antique. It seemed to have tarnished under its glass somewhat, making the reflection even dimmer than it would otherwise be. There were spots speckled across the mirror. It even had a fancy frame in an undulating pattern. He reached out. It was cold and otherwise exactly how he would expect it to be. He got back into a proper crouch and reached around the corner of the mirror. It did not come loose. However, it was fixed to the back wall of this apparently dirt-walled cave. It was strongly done. What other strange things were in here, he wondered. He continued chewing his cheek while he checked the walls, bit by bit. He went all the way around until he came back to the mirror. Then he checked the floor, which was smooth and free of unusual details. He finally checked the ceiling. It wasn't quite as smooth, having some roots from other plants poking down here and there, but nothing stood out to Tom. He went back to the mirror. He was forced back into a crouch by the sloping ceiling. As he approached, his toe caught, and he stumbled forward, almost banging his face into the mirror. He bit deep into his cheek, which was deeply cut. "Ah!" he yelled, spitting blood in the mirror. "Thank you," his reflection whispered. Tom's blood ran cold. He didn't wait to see if the reflection had changed. He immediately turned and scrambled for the exit. This was fortunate, as the root ball was already coming down, though slowly. That shouldn't happen, he thought, but he doubled his efforts. He belly-crawled up the incline at the exit as the roots dropped lower and lower. Just when he thought he was free, his foot was caught. He looked down, expecting to see a root catching him. Instead, he saw a hand, the hand of a boy his age, but gray and brown, mottled and painfully strong. He kicked and managed to break free. He ran back towards his home, blindly, almost running into the fence when he finally reached it. He ran yelling into his house. Anne came running into the front hall. "What's wrong?" she barely started to ask when he fell into her arms. She quickly saw his ankle, which had blood soaking through the sock. "Let's get you to the tub, Tom," she said, and swept him up, almost carrying him there. Soon she had checked him from head to toe and found only the ankle was really damaged, other than a few scrapes he got while scrambling out of the cave. "What happened?" she asked. He found that he couldn't tell her all he had seen, so he said that he had gotten his foot caught in some roots and had panicked. "I was afraid of that," his mom replied. "I wanted you to feel free to go around the woods. I didn't want you to be paranoid. But maybe I should have told you from the start." "What?" "Well, your Uncle Terry. Something similar happened to him, but much worse," she said. "Luckily, our neighbor Fred is an old busybody and noticed Terry taking a walk. Then he noticed that Terry hadn't done anything else for a couple of days. Well, he got concerned. He knocked on the door, then decided to walk around the property. In the pasture out back, he found Terry barely alive. He couldn't wake him, so he ran back to his house. You met him. You know it doesn't matter what year it is, he'll still have a landline phone only. And called for an ambulance and got some water. He brought the water back to Terry and was able to get a few drops in him, carefully. The ambulance showed up and they took Terry back to the hospital, but he died on the way. The EMT said he had a brief moment of semi-consciousness and said a few words about a cave and being trapped. Well, there was an investigation, but not much could be found. The people who know the area pretty well say there are no large natural caves around due to the kind of stone the cliffs are made out of. He could have been referring to an old bear's den. Best they could figure is that he got his foot badly trapped, then managed to free himself after a long time, but then he was too weak. Tom didn't say anything. He had his doubts about what had happened to Uncle Terry, but didn't dare say them out aloud. Tom never walked in the woods again. Instead, he pretended to be interested in sports so that he could have a lot of extra activities and not seem to be avoiding the forest. It became such a strong impulse in him that eventually he even started to actually like them. But he often caught himself looking back at the forest, never too far from the house, and wondering who had put the mirror in the cave and what had happened to him and to Uncle Terry. And that's today's episode. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have any comments or questions about this episode or previous episodes, cryptobiography@gmail.com, or hit us up on Facebook or Twitter. And thanks for listening. Words and music, copyright 2019, CryptoBiography LLC, all rights reserved. Characters and events are fictional, fictionalized, or satirical.